Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Hannah Tyler, research analyst for BPC's Immigration Project, and I'll be filling in over the next several episodes for Blake Johnson, who is a proud new papa. Congratulations, Blake! In this week's episode, we're discussing the U.S. Mexico relationship and how immigration factors into it. Theresa will be joined by Ambassador Arturo Sarukhán, who served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013 under President Felipe Calderon. He is a co-chair of a Ford Foundation Global Americans Task Force on Inter-American Relations, the founder and president of Sarukhán and Associates, and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings.
Welcome back. We are happy to have with us today Ambassador Arturo Sarukhán, who has decades of experience in U.S. Mexico relations and a deep insight into the immigration aspect of the relationship. We are glad to have him on the podcast. You can also find him on Twitter at Arturo_Sarukhán, and he is widely published in many newspapers of record in both English and Spanish. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's a pleasure, Theresa.
So, as I said, you've been a scholar and participant in the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship for many years and seen it from both sides of the border. So, the two countries have had a relationship that has evolved a lot, especially for two countries that share a border and a lot of history. How would you characterize the overall relationship between the United States and Mexico today?
That's a good question, and one that doesn't have a straightforward or simple answer. Let me put it this way. It is recovering from 4 years of almost disaster and a precipice, triggered by, obviously, the previous U.S. president's decision to ransom the whole relationship to the issue, first of the renegotiation of NAFTA and now USMCA, which we were fortunately able to maintain alive. It was sort of the proverbial story of NAFTA living to fight another day. And the other issue was obviously the border, in particular in regards to immigration policy, a president that approached Mexico with huge contempt, with an anti-Mexican narrative that was core to his 2016 election, and with unfortunately two approaches which run so counter to what has been built in the U.S.-Mexico relationship over the past 3 decades. The first one is linkage of policy issues. That is, there had been a non-written principle of agreement for the very complex dynamics of this bilateral relationship, that if you have, let's say, a controversy on trade matters, you solve that controversy within the trade silo. You don't bring in other issues to bear, to leverage, to put pressure on that issue. The reasoning is very simple. This is one of the most complex bilateral relationships that the U.S. has on the face of the earth. And if you start contaminating the solution of specific issues with other non-related issues in the agenda, you're gonna bring the agenda to a standstill. And so what we saw with Trump, by threatening to impose punitive tariffs on Mexico, contingent on Mexico stopping the flow of Central American transmigration through Mexico in March of 2019, was a very, very clear example of what I'm getting at in this violation of non-written principles of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. The other one was what I would call his Sinatra doctrine of my way or the highway. That is that the pursuit of diplomatic and political ultimatums in the relationship, which again scuppers one of the guiding principles of this relationship, which is that the only way Mexico and the United States will be able to take advantage of both the challenges and the opportunities that we face in this extremely complex bilateral relationship is under a principle of joint responsibility. That is, basically, that neither of us can solve or address or confront the issues that we face, whether it's drugs and thugs or immigration or energy issues or trade, on our own, that we have to work together to find common solutions. And so what Donald Trump did was basically almost single-handedly dynamite the bilateral relationship. So we're certainly in a much better place than we were in the previous 4 years, Theresa. But I started by saying that it was not an easy answer to respond, because while particularly the Biden administration has been trying to revamp, reset the U.S. Mexico relationship by going back to the institutional framework that had been built in the U.S. Mexico relationship over 2 decades, reconvening fora and mechanisms that had been left in limbo during these past 4 years. The truth of the matter is that we're still not in an optimum place, in part, in a great measure, because President López Obrador of Mexico doesn't understand foreign policy, doesn't like foreign policy, doesn't understand the United States, and sees the relationship with the United States in a very transactional way. That is what, in many ways, led to his very unfortunate decision in March of 2019 to bend the knee vis-a-vis Trump and remain in Mexico and the paradigm of migration policy that Mexico has been enacting since then. And second, because precisely on this issue, I fear that the Biden administration, and I understand the domestic political drivers that have led the Biden administration to take these types of decisions, but given that immigration policy, the border, we just saw it again this weekend in Texas with President Trump's speech, the pimping of the Mexico-U.S. border for political purposes. Heading into the midterm elections, this is an issue which I think the Biden administration, the president, wants to ensure is not used to challenge the president's record and to challenge the record of Democrats on the Hill. So in a certain sense, what has happened is that the bilateral relationship with Mexico, until very recently, there are signs now that the Biden administration is finally sort of widening the bandwidth of engagement with Mexico on both domestic and also bilateral issues. But there's been a sort of a sense that somehow the Biden administration may have fallen into what Europe did with Erdogan during the Syrian refugee crises, which was sort of the quid pro quo of turning a blind eye to issues in the relationship between Turkey and the European Union, internal domestic affairs in Turkey that were problematic, to say the least, as long as Turkey stopped the flow of migrants and refugees from Turkey, from Turkish coasts, or via the Turkish landmass into the European Union. And in many ways, what we've seen, at least until the latter part of 2021 with the United States, is that basically the U.S. decided to sort of not annoy, not provide López Obrador with excuses to shut down that collaboration on immigration policy, which we've seen to this day.
It's interesting to me because looking back to, say the beginning of the Bush administration, George W. Bush, right? That was a turning point. Migration issues between the United States and Mexico had been a point of friction for many, many years. And George W. Bush came in seeking with then President Vicente Fox of Mexico to make it what you called that mutual responsibility to address the border and address migration. And that seemed to be a turning point for relations, at least on the immigration issue between the United States and Mexico until Trump. And certainly when you were ambassador, one of the key questions there was, how can we see the border not as only an enforcement point, but as a collaborative point, look at the trade and facilitation, and then mutually, what can we do about immigration? Do you think that this shift to migration is the centrality of the relationship right now? Is that likely to continue? Do you think that that's a place that's just going to land for a while? Or do you think there's ways to kind of get back to that more collaborative kind of conversation that you've been talking about?
I'm optimistic that the Biden administration is slowly opening the sort of the arc of engagement with Mexico and that its bandwidth is widening. But it is foreseeable that at least between now and November, Theresa, the issue of migration will continue to drive and lead engagement with Mexico simply because of how this issue plays domestically in the U.S. at this given point, how it's become a third rail of domestic U.S. politics, how a good number of Republicans are positioning themselves on the issue of immigration and refugee policies in general. So I think that at least in the short, medium term, it will continue to sort of, I think we've moved beyond the point, fortunately, where it was the sole issue being addressed and discussed with Mexico, as we've seen with the flurry of diplomatic engagement of the Biden administration towards the end of last year, opening up that portfolio of issues with Mexico. But I think in the short term, immigration will continue to sort of be the most salient point of engagement between Washington and Mexico City. And a bit of the concern that I have there, and you sort of mentioned some of this when you were referring to how the relationship evolved. And it was actually really, you're correct in underscoring that Bush 43 played a role, but it was really not with Fox, it was with Calderon and with Bush 43, that this paradigm of joint responsibility was sort of crafted as the leitmotif of the bilateral relationship, and then that was expanded and broadened with President Obama. But what I think was there are several things that I want to piggyback on regarding your question. The first one was that you saw a very important change in how Mexico engaged the United States and the body politic of the United States regarding immigration during the Fox administration, when Mexico, for the first time, put on the table a qualitatively different approach to the way Mexico had bilaterally dealt with immigration issues with the United States by starting to talk about what later became known as comprehensive immigration reform. That is, that unless you addressed the 4 or 5 fundamental drivers of U.S. immigration policy and of migration flows between our two countries, and were able to cut through the Gordian knots of what you do with 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, how do you think of and address circular labor mobility between both countries, how do you enhance border security, how do you rethink visa policy and the thresholds for how many H-2As and how many H-2Bs and sort of the arcane numbers behind visa policy in the United States, that unless we were able to holistically address all these issues with a whole of government approach in what trade negotiators for many, many decades called a single undertaking negotiation, which was you can't just reach an agreement on temporary workers if you don't reach an agreement on what you do with 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, for purely political reasons. Labor generally doesn't tend to like temporary worker programs. The business sector and some Republican states do, because the ag sector is critically dependent on farm workers. So if we were going to bring sort of one part of the political spectrum in the United States on board, they were going to have to get some things they like. Labor, that was obviously in favor of bringing 11 million people out of the shadows, because many of those people will eventually could become card-carrying members of unions. The right didn't like that. So finding those compromises and ensuring that we had a comprehensive deal on all these issues, that was the first time that Mexico and the United States started talking about this. And in many ways, it's one of those occasions where Mexico ended up putting in the heart of a domestic political debate in the United States the concept of comprehensive immigration reform as a centerpiece of how to solve the issue. So that's a very interesting part. The second part is something that was very clear from that moment and has continued to be clear to this day, and you know this very well, which is that we can sort of Einstein, or people say that Einstein said this, though many argue that it wasn't actually him. Einstein's famous definition of insanity is doing something time and time and time again and expecting different results. That is what we have been doing. And now I would have said you have been doing, but with what Mexico, with López Obrador has been doing with Trump and now with Biden, I will refer to the we. What we have not learned is that you will never, ever solve a migration crisis via enforcement. That is not going to turn the needle. I'm not saying that you don't enforce your borders. You have to. In the 21st century, with the challenges and the threats to security, particularly in a post 9/11 world, obviously, two countries like Mexico and the United States need to work hand in hand to ensure that our borders are secure. But if we don't address the structural causes that trigger migration, whether it's economic opportunity, whether it's the strength of institutions, whether it's public security, like what we're seeing today, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras and El Salvador in particular, if you don't understand how labor mobility written large needs to be thought of in taking advantage of human capital, of the demands of labor, of the market, of ensuring that there is a circular, legal, transparent, orderly way of ensuring labor mobility, we will continue to make the same mistakes of thinking that you can enforce your way out of a migration crisis.
I mean, I think that perspective, we get lost, right? We get lost in our domestic politics and our domestic legislation and, who's on board and who's what. But really understanding that for the bilateral relationship, addressing all of these issues is as important as it is for the domestic politics in the United States. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the domestic politics in Mexico, right? When President López Obrador came into power, it seemed like he was going to be more open to the migrants that were coming through Mexico. He talked about giving them work visas and helping them to, sort of establish ability to support themselves while they were trying to get into the United States. But then that sort of shifted, even I think before some of the threats that came from President Trump, but certainly following that, to a much more heavy-handed enforcement model, even in Mexico, right? The National Guard at the U.S. Mexico border, and now especially at the border with Guatemala. He also took away funding from COMAR, the Mexican Asylum and Refugee Agency. And so he seems to have taken a harder stand. Do you see that in response to sort of what he was feeling from the United States, or is there domestic political incentives for him in the way he's positioning Mexico right now?
Andrew Cuomo famously said that you campaign in prose, but that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. Part of that is what has happened with López Obrador. It's very easy to say things on the campaign trail. He said a lot of things which today everyone is sort of rubbing in his face and saying, this is López Obrador the candidate and this is López Obrador the president. So there's a part of it is that. Part of it is that he is unable to connect the dots of sort of how Mexico devises and designs immigration policy and the relationship with the United States. He has ignored, as someone who cut his teeth as a politician in the 1970s as a member of the PRI that was in power for 70 plus years, López Obrador has a very black and white vision of foreign affairs and of the relationship with the United States. For starters, his misunderstanding that in this relationship, there's no such thing as a division between domestic policy and foreign policy. In the U.S. Mexico relationship, this is an intermestic relationship. That is, domestic policy is piece and parcel of our bilateral relationship of foreign policy and vice versa. And so things that he's done that in his mind have nothing to do with what he's doing in the U.S. Mexico relationship, like eviscerating the budget of Mexico's National Immigration Agency or Mexico's Refugee and Asylum Commission because of his ill-conceived austerity drive, where he has cut budgets, he has eviscerated these agencies, he's reduced the number of personnel. And then obviously his only resort is to use the National Guard, which was not designed to do immigration control tasks. And so it's the typical jumble of policies where he does not perceive or see how these intersect and impact the relationship with the United States. He did start off the administration almost by welcoming Central American migrants, and that in part explains why at the beginning of his administration we saw a big uptick in the number of Central American migrants who thought they were going to get visas and work permits and the permission to travel through Mexico to the U.S. Mexico border, which he said during the time as a candidate, and then obviously the reality of the relationship with Trump when sort of Trump started threatening punitive tariffs, and unfortunately President López Obrador blinked and kowtowed to Trump's bullying. There is a certain relevance of Mexican domestic politics because as a result of some of the caravans, particularly in 2019, you did start seeing some important pushback by governors and mayors of border states and border cities that, as a result of Remain in Mexico, started to face huge challenges, socioeconomic, to be able to handle the fact that there were thousands of Central American, Haitian refugees in their municipalities and their states without the resources to be able to address that. And you started getting a bit of you started getting a bit of pushback in those communities, and unfortunately, you started getting a bit of a stench of xenophobia of Mexicans saying, you know, why the hell should Mexico be? Why should we care about these migrants? We should chuck them out. And I immediately went to the airwaves and my columns and my tweets saying, you know, it's rich that a country like Mexico that has 5 million undocumented migrants in the United States is now saying that we should send Central American migrants back when Mexico has 5 million undocumented migrants and when those migrants are sending record levels of remittances back home, particularly these last years during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have to think, you know, some of this is caused by some of the policies that the U.S. has foisted on them. Like you said, Remain in Mexico, the Migrant Protection Protocols, Title 42, both of which the United States could not implement without Mexican cooperation, right? We're taking non-Mexican nationals and asking Mexico to take them back, something that has never really happened before in these numbers. We're placing that responsibility on Mexico. And, you know, and it's fomenting some of this domestic policy. I mean, and yet we're continuing with it. Like you mentioned earlier, when the courts ordered the Biden administration to restart MPP, to me, it would seem like a no-brainer that if Mexico said, no, we're not going to allow this anymore, then they had a perfectly valid way to go back to the courts to say, well, we tried, but it's up to Mexico to allow this to happen. And yet they didn't. They managed to negotiate a renewal of the program, supposedly with additional safeguards, although it's unclear how that's working, and actually expand it to different nationalities. And Title 42 continues.
I think it was a huge missed opportunity for both governments, Theresa. I think it could have allowed both governments, it could have allowed Mexico to finally rethink and redesign a holistic migration and refugee policy, regardless of the pressures from the United States, sort of to have an enlightened migration and refugee policy, which we have not had since the Peña Nieto administration, certainly when Peña Nieto in 2014 started sending Central American migrants back across the border with Guatemala. It was also an opportunity for the Biden administration to sort of pause, try and rethink, try and sort of reorder the disastrous legacy it inherited from the previous administration on immigration and refugee policy. And yet here we are back in the same place. And it's tough because even though instinctively, I would like to have said, you know, tell them that we're not willing to do it. At the same time, I remember when I was Ambassador, Theresa, and you may recall when the Kennedy-McCain bill was being discussed in 2007, I'll share a secret with you. I remember that there was discussion back then of incorporating a touchback clause.
Yes.
The idea was that the 11 million individuals who were illegally in the United States would have to exit the United States, go back to their countries of origin, and then come back with some form of authorization to start their migration regularization process. We knew that was going to be crazy. We knew that if the U.S. Congress did approve that, we were going to be faced by a de facto sort of remain in Mexico 0.01 back in 2007, because many people, from India and Bangladesh and China and Poland that were here without papers, were not going to be able to go back to their countries. So we thought, here's an opportunity for Mexico to show that we are serious when we talk about shared responsibility. And in providing a solution to Congress, which was, I went to Harry Reid and said, we would be willing to have, not in a sort of, not in one single wave, but to have this orderly process where all these individuals who are without papers in the US can come across the border to Mexico, get documented in US consulates along the border region between Mexico and the United States, and then come back. And that way we can help you with an issue which may be the one that finally solves the impasse on Kennedy McCain. So having said what I've just said, you can also understand why I think it's hard for me to argue and to sort of frontally attack the Mexican administration and say, you should have said, we're not going to do this.
You did just release a secret from all those years ago, although some of us may have known that was in the works. But let me ask you a question then. In that case, though, the benefit to Mexico of saying we'll help you with this problem is that the millions of Mexican undocumented people in the United States would have their opportunity to be legalized, right? That was the trade-off. You mentioned the comprehensive value. So there was a kind of quid pro quo. You could see what Mexico would gain. I guess we're still trying to figure out, what is Mexico gaining from continuing their cooperation with MPP and Title 42 at this point right now?
In my view, very little, Theresa.
Okay.
Because I don't see López Obrador with a strategic and ambitious vision of the relationship. If I was foreign minister, if I was president of Mexico, I'd say, okay, I will help you, Biden, because A, you're my friend. 2, you're not putting a gun to my head like your predecessor did. 3, because I believe in joint responsibility. But, in exchange, I want Mexico not to be taken for granted in Washington. I want real significant engagement by the administration on a number of issues which are salient to Mexico, whether it's gun trafficking across the border into Mexico from the United States, whether it's really devising the sort of the roadmap for the future of the U.S. Mexico relationship and how, for example, Mexico should be playing a key role in thinking in Washington as Washington recalibrates its relationship with China, and how Mexico and Canada are key in, because of the supply chains, in being able to develop a paradigm for greater competitiveness and greater, for example, cybersecurity vis-a-vis China. So the problem is, there could be an opportunity to be ambitious and to really obtain quid pro quos that help the relationship, and not, unfortunately, the quid pro quo that I think is prevalent in López Obrador's mind, which is, by doing this for Biden, I am buying a one-way ticket in ensuring that Biden won't talk about issues that I think are domestic Mexican politics and where I don't want the U.S. talking about, which is the rule of law, the erosion of checks and balances in Mexico's democracy, the attack on the media, the attack on autonomous regulators, which López Obrador feels are a purely domestic Mexican political issue, and which from the get-go, one of the reasons why he did what he did in being, along with Putin and Xi Jinping, the last 3 leaders to congratulate Biden on his electoral victory, his calculus was that Biden, contrary to Trump, who couldn't care less about anything related to Mexico except the border issues that served to throw red meat at his base, that Biden would, in private and in public, because of the long exposure Joe Biden has had to issues related to Mexico during his career as a senator and as vice president, that Joe Biden would speak up in private or in public about issues that López Obrador thinks are domestic. So the problem, Theresa, is at the end of the day, I think if you were to ask me, why is Mexico doing this? Because in López Obrador's mind, this is probably his way, his thinking of, I do this for him, then I can ensure that my quid pro quo is, you don't talk about issues that I don't want you to talk about in terms of domestic Mexican politics.
That's interesting. I mean, we did see a little bit at the time of the announcement, additional vaccines being sent to Mexico, and even agreement for the Southern Mexico investment program, the tree planting that Lopez Obrador wanted. But that seemed like minor compared to what they're taking on with MPP and Title 42.
And to be very frank, I hope that what you suggest about, when Kerry was down there in Mexico and, there was talk about, okay, we'll support this, that it was more an effort to do a bit of jujitsu and write in a program which is doing everything the wrong way. It's creating deforestation by perverse incentives, by paying people money to cut down and then say that they're replanting. So some of this is concerning.
Some needs to be fixed. Well, let me ask you about a more recent phenomenon. I mean, especially since Title 42 and the entry of COVID, we've actually seen a lot more Mexicans coming across the U.S. Mexico border again. I mean, Mexican migration to the United States was down since the recession in 2007 to 2009. It had not come back. And now we are seeing high numbers of Mexicans crossing the border again, resuming patterns that we last saw in the early 2000s. Why do you think that is, and how do you think that new wrinkle might affect the relationship?
That's a huge change. When I was ambassador, we started seeing zero net migration and then zero negative migration of Mexicans to the U.S., which was an incredibly important development for a lot of political and diplomatic reasons. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this one out. It's the fact that Mexico is one of the very, very few countries on the face of the earth that did diddly squat, zilch, in terms of economic stimuli, security nets during the pandemic. The economy has not been growing. In fact, we're in a technical recession right now. It'll grow a bit more this year, but the collapse of the Mexican economy, plus the fact that you had a president that, because of fiscal austerity, decided not to rescue small and medium-sized businesses and farmers. What you're seeing now, this increase in unaccompanied male adult Mexicans, again appearing on the border, trying to cross the border illegally, is I think, an indictment of the economic and social policies that López Obrador undertook to confront the pandemic.
So let's look ahead. Where do you see the future of this relationship going? You mentioned, we're halfway through the López Obrador administration. We're just 1 year into the Biden administration. Where do you think the two countries need to go next on migration in this relationship?
Well, I think certainly because of the lay of the land in the U.S. today, it is, I think, unfortunately, but increasingly unlikely that we will be able to cobble a comprehensive approach to immigration reform in the U.S. anytime soon. So something that you and others have been debating for a long time, whether we start cutting up the sausage into little pieces and approving specific components of immigration reform, whether it's streamers, whether it's some form of temporary worker program. And in this regard, that is where I think there is an opportunity, because if you look at the dynamics that the pandemic lay bare, if you saw the role of essential workers, if you saw how forget about international, domestic supply chains to the supermarkets, to greengrocers in the United States were affected by the pandemic. And given the political makeup of not only the electoral college in the states and the electoral college, but also what's happening in some of these states, I think there could be an opportunity after November to try and put back the issue of devising a temporary worker a modern 21st century temporary worker program that works. There's already a blueprint out there. I was a member of the task force that worked on this blueprint. It's ready. If anyone in Washington or in Capitol Hill wants to look at how a U.S. Mexico temporary worker program would work, and it was done with, by the way, the support of important groups of unions. SEIU was a very important member in this task force, so it's already there. So I think there's that opportunity in the short run. I think that whenever our two presidential electoral cycles coincide, as they do every 12 years, in 2024 we will have a presidential election in Mexico and a presidential election in the United States. These are moments where we can really sort of try and put bold ideas forward to try and sort of find new directions in the relationship. And I certainly think that maybe after November and before 2024, both governments could work on an ambitious, visionary, groundbreaking temporary worker program that provides labor mobility across the U.S. Mexico border in a legal, orderly, safe fashion that ensures the labor rights of workers, that ensures that no one's breaking the law, that employers have trained individuals who come back and forth every year on a visa through an international airport, and that we build upon that huge promise of human capital that both our countries have.
Well, this has been very, very enlightening. We covered a whole lot of ground. Ambassador Arturo Sarukhán, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration. And let's hope that your predictions come true.
I hope so.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and Hanadi Jordan. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.